Once Upon Yesterday, the podcast where we dust off the history books. I'm your host, James, and today we're going to explore one of the most intimidating forces the ancient world ever saw, the Roman war machine. Now, when I say war machine, I don't mean a robot from Transformers or some diesel powered tank. I mean thousands of disciplined soldiers, drilled like clockwork, armed to the teeth, and organized in a way that could flatten almost any enemy that stood in their path. Here's the thing: Rome wasn't supposed to be special. In the beginning, it was just one more scrappy city state among dozens on the Italian peninsula. No marble forums, no sprawling empire. Just farmers who doubled as weekend warriors when their city needed defending. And yet, over the centuries, those farmers built an army that could conquer most of the known world. Think about that for a second. From muddy hills outside a little village on the Tiber River to ruling Spain, Gaul, North Africa, Greece, Egypt, and beyond. That transformation wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the army, the legion, the war machine. Today, we are going to march alongside it. We'll see how the Roman military evolved from a clumsy phalanx of spear-carrying farmers into a professional force of career soldiers. We'll break down the weapons and armor that made each soldier a walking arsenal. We'll look at the tactics, the shield walls, the tuxedo, the rotations that let them outlast and outmaneuver their enemies. And to really see it in action, we'll walk through 3 battles: Cannae, Rome's darkest hour, when Hannibal surrounded and destroyed a Roman army in one of history's greatest tactical traps. We'll look at Alesia, Julius Caesar's crowning triumph, where Roman engineering and grit crushed a massive Gallic uprising. And lastly, we'll look at the Teutoburg Forest, the nightmare ambush where 3 legions disappeared into the German woods and never came back. These stories aren't just about battles. They're about resilience, and sometimes overconfidence. Rome's war machine was unstoppable until it wasn't. So grab your sandals, tighten your shield strap, and let's take a march through history together. Let's rewind to the very beginning of Rome's military story, long before Caesar, before Augustus, even before the word legion meant anything. We're talking about the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, when Rome was still just a tough little city-state on the Tiber River. At this point, Rome didn't have professional soldiers. There were no barracks, no standing army. Instead, Rome's defense was built on what historians call the civic militia system. If you owned land, congratulations, you were now eligible to fight. Think of it like jury duty, except with a higher chance of not coming home. Farmers would plant crops in the spring, grab their shields and spears in the summer, and hope to be back by harvest. It wasn't glamorous, it was survival. And the way they fought was borrowed straight from the Greeks, the hoplite phalanx. Picture a big block of men, shoulder to shoulder, each holding a round shield and a long spear. It was less about individual skill and more about a group being one giant moving wall. It looked intimidating, and in the wide open plains of Greece, it worked beautifully. But here's the problem: Italy isn't Greece. The terrain around Rome was rugged with hills, woods, and valleys. A giant wall of guys with 8-foot spears doesn't maneuver well when you're marching uphill or weaving through forests. Imagine trying to push a shopping cart through a crowded subway station. The phalanx was powerful, but it was clumsy. Rome's neighbors noticed too. They weren't fighting elegant set-piece battles like in Homer's epics. They fought guerrilla style, ambushes, small skirmishes, mobility over mass. Rome realized quickly, if you can't bend, you break. So, in the 4th century BCE, Rome started tinkering with its army design, and what they created was revolutionary: the manipular legion. Instead of one giant, rigid block, the army was broken into smaller units, maniples, each about 120 men. Polybius, a Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BCE, describes this in his Histories, Book 6. He praised the system for being flexible, able to move like chess pieces on the board rather than a single lumbering blob. Here's how it worked. Maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern called the quinquenix. One unit in front, one behind, another offset to the side. Gaps in the lines let units advance or retreat without breaking formation. Picture a football team with multiple squads that can sub in and out mid-play, always keeping pressure on the opponent. This new structure was brilliant for Italy's uneven battlefields. If one maniple was struggling, another could shift to cover. If the enemy pressed, fresh troops rotated forward. It gave Rome a toolbox instead of just one blunt hammer. And the best part? It built resilience into the system. Rome could still lose a battle and still recover because the machine wasn't dependent on one formation or one general. Every Roman citizen knew the drill. Every maniple was a piece of a much larger, adaptable puzzle. This was the foundation of what would become the Roman war machine, an army that learned, innovated, and refused to stop marching. Now that Rome had its new chessboard-style maniples, it needed the right tools. Let's do an ancient version of an unboxing video. What exactly did a Roman soldier carry, and why was it so effective? First up, we have the helmet, or galea. Made of bronze or iron, with cheek guards and sometimes a neck guard, it gave protection without sacrificing vision or hearing. Some helmets even had little crossbars to deflect sword blows. And unlike in the movies, not every Roman soldier strutted around with a big red plume. Those fancy crests were usually for officers. Polybius notes they were used to help men spot their leaders in the chaos of battle. Next, we have the body armor. Early soldiers wore chainmail, lorica hamata, made of thousands of interlocked iron rings. It was heavy but flexible, great for mobility. Later, under the Empire, we see the famous segmented plate armor, lorica segmentata. Think of it like ancient tactical body armor, overlapping metal strips strapped together with leather. Archaeologist M.C. Bishop argues this gave protection equal to or better than medieval plate, but with way more flexibility. Now, the star of the show, the shield, the scutum. Forget the small round hoplite shields. The Roman scutum was a beast, about 3.5 feet tall, curved to wrap around the body, with a central iron boss. Polybius describes it as covering the soldier from shoulders to knees. This meant that the Roman soldier was basically a walking door with a sword. The curve allowed it to deflect blows, and when used in formation, these shields created a near impenetrable wall. Speaking of swords, the gladius. At only about 20 inches long, it looks almost unimpressive compared to the Greek spears or barbarian broadswords. But the Romans didn't want flashy. They wanted efficient. Vegetius, a Roman military writer from the 4th century CE, says stabbing was more deadly than slashing. A stab 2 inches deep is usually fatal. So the gladius was the perfect stabbing weapon. Short, fast, deadly in close quarters. But wait, before the gladius came into play, the soldiers had the pilum. This wasn't just your average javelin. The pilum had a long wooden shaft and soft iron shank designed to bend on impact. This meant two things. One, it pierced shields and armor better than most spears. And two, even if it didn't kill you, it ruined your shield by sticking in it. And because it bent, the enemy couldn't just pick it up and throw it back. Imagine throwing a boomerang that ruins your opponent's equipment but never comes back. Genius. Add to this the pugio, a small side dagger, a sling bag. Yes, every Roman legionary carried a sling, and in the imperial period, sometimes even a short spear, or throwing darts called plumbatae. Each soldier was essentially a mobile Swiss army knife. And then there's the unsung hero, the soldier's backpack. Every legionary carried tools, a cooking pot, a cloak, food rations, and even stakes for building camp defenses. Vegetius tells us Roman soldiers were trained to march carrying about 80 pounds of gear. Historians call them Marius's mules, after the general who reformed the army in the late Republic. Picture a Roman legionary. He's not just a fighter. He's a construction worker, a backpacker, and a moving company all rolled into one. Now zoom out from one soldier to the whole legion. By the late Republic, a legion was about 4,800 to 5,000 men, 10 cohorts, each with 6 centuries, and each century commanded by a centurion, the grizzled NCOs of the Roman world. Centurions were famous for being strict but effective. They carried a vine staff called a vetus and weren't afraid to use it to keep discipline. So imagine it. Thousands of men, all equipped the same way, drilled the same way, marching in perfect formation. To enemies, especially the tribal groups with mixed weapons and no standard gear, this wasn't just an army. It was a machine. A machine that looked the same on day 1 of battle as on day 100. Adrian Goldsworthy, in The Complete Roman Army, sums it up. The uniformity of equipment and training gave the legions a cohesion unmatched in the ancient world. And it wasn't just about intimidation. Standardization made logistics easier. Replace a shield, repair a helmet, issue a new pila. The whole army functioned like an assembly line, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so now we've got our Roman soldier kitted out, helmet polished, shield strapped, gladius ready. But how did thousands of these guys actually fight together? Let's step into formation. The most iconic Roman setup was the triplex aces, literally triple battle line. Imagine 3 rows of troops staggered like a checkerboard. At the front were the hastati, younger, less experienced men eager to prove themselves. Behind them stood the principes, seasoned pros, and anchoring the rear were the triarii, battle-hardened veterans who were basically Rome's emergency break-glass option. Polybius in Book 6 notes the Roman saying, "It has come to the triarii," which meant things had gotten serious. The brilliance here was rotation. When the hastati got tired, they could fall back through the gaps, and the principes stepped forward fresh. It was like having hockey lines that you can switch mid-battle. Enemies often had one big push. The Romans had staying power. Now let's try the testito, or tortoise formation. Picture you and your buddies locking your scuda, the big rectangular shields, side by side in front, and others raising them overhead to form a roof. Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, brags about using this formation during sieges, saying it let his soldiers advance almost without injury from any missiles. Basically, it was the ancient version of an armored personnel carrier, except powered by human quads. To the enemy, it looked like a giant armored box inching toward your walls. To the guys inside, it felt like being in the world's most claustrophobic tent. Romans also mastered the use of combined arms. Infantry were the core, but cavalry covered the wings, and light skirmishers, armed with javelins or slings, harassed the enemy before the heavy infantry closed in. Think of it as rock, paper, scissors, but Rome made sure to bring all 3 every time. Another favorite tactic was the hammer and anvil. The legions formed the steady anvil, locking shields and grinding forward. Meanwhile, cavalry swept around to strike from behind, the hammer. Once the enemy was pinned between the two, it was game over. And don't underestimate Roman drill and discipline. Vegetius in Book 1 emphasizes constant training, marching long distances in formation, throwing pila, practicing sword thrusts. He says, "Victory in war does not depend entirely upon numbers or mere courage. Only skill and discipline will ensure it. Soldiers weren't just strong, they were drilled to respond instantly to commands, like muscle memory. Here's what it looked like. The horn sounds. Pila are hurled, thousands of heavy javelins raining down to shatter shields and open gaps. The legion advance in unison, shields locked, gladii stabbing in the chaos. Officers and centurions bark orders, keeping men in line. And every night, whether marching or not, they built a fortified camp. Ditches, palisades, gates, all laid out with military precision. Mary Beard, in SPQR, calls this an army that carried Rome with it, because every campsite was a miniature Rome, organized into neat streets and blocks. Enemies saw chaos, the Romans brought order, even into the wilderness. So imagine standing in that shield wall. You are shoulder to shoulder with your sentry. You hear the horns, you throw your pilum. It crashes into an enemy shield. Now shield up, push forward. You jab with your gladius. Not wide swings, but quick, deadly thrusts through gaps in armor. Your buddy to the left covers your flank. Your buddy to the right covers his. The maniple moves as one. That's the secret of the Roman war machine. It wasn't about one hero or one flashy move. It was about the group, drilled to act like a single living organism. And when you multiply that by 5,000 men in a legion, that's when enemies start realizing they weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a system. All right, time to march into one of the most infamous battles in Roman history, Cannae. If the Roman war machine ever looked unstoppable, it was here. And if it ever looked painfully human, it was here too. It's 216 BCE. Rome is locked in the Second Punic War against Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian commander who had already marched elephants across the Alps. Yes, elephants. Rome had been humiliated in early battles, so this time they went big. The Senate gathered maybe 80,000 men, one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled. Polybius estimates around 70,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Livy goes even higher. Either way, it was massive. The idea was simple: overwhelm Hannibal by sheer numbers. Hannibal? He had about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Outnumbered, yes, but he had a plan. Now, picture the battlefield. A flat plain near the river Aufidus in southern Italy. Perfect ground for cavalry. And Hannibal knew it. He lined up his troops in a curious way. His weakest soldiers, the Celts and Iberians, in the center. The stronger African infantry on the flanks. Cavalry on both wings. And here's where genius comes in. Hannibal formed his center in a convex curve, bulging outward toward the Romans. When the Romans attacked, their huge mass pressed forward, driving Hannibal's center backward. Slowly, that convex line bent inward, like a bowstring being pulled back. The Romans thought they were breaking through. In reality, they were walking into a trap. As the Roman infantry surged forward, Hannibal's African veterans on the flanks pivoted inward. Meanwhile, his cavalry, superior to Rome's, drove off the Roman horsemen and then charged into the rear. Suddenly, the Roman army was completely surrounded. Polybius calls it the double envelopment, one of the rarest and deadliest maneuvers in military history. Now imagine being a Roman soldier in that moment. You've marched all day, in the summer heat, dust stings your eyes, you're pressed so tightly against your comrades you can't even swing your sword. The shield on your left arm feels like dead weight, but you can't lower it. There's no room. Hannibal's men are hacking into the flanks, cavalry is charging into the rear. The formation that once gave Rome invincibility is now a death trap. Polybius describes how the sheer crush of men killed as many Romans as Carthaginian blades. Soldiers couldn't raise their arms to fight or even breathe. Livy says the slaughter went on until the Carthaginians were literally tired of killing. And the numbers are staggering. Ancient sources claim 50,000 to 70,000 Romans killed in a single day. For comparison, that's more than the US lost in the entire Vietnam War in about 6 hours of combat. It was Rome's worst defeat. The war machine had run headlong into an opponent who understood it better than they understood themselves. And yet, here's the incredible part: Rome did not surrender. Most states would have thrown in the towel after a disaster like Cannae, but Rome dug in, raised new legions, and fought on. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy points out that this resilience, the refusal to quit even after a catastrophic loss, is one of the true secrets of the Roman system. So Cannae is both a humiliation and a lesson. It showed the vulnerability of the Roman war machine when misused, but it also showed the stubborn resilience that would one day bring Hannibal to defeat at Zama. If Cannae showed us Rome at its lowest point, Alesia shows Rome at its peak. This was the moment when the war machine looked less like an army and more like a force of nature. It's 52 BCE. Julius Caesar has spent years campaigning in Gaul, modern France, conquering tribes, building roads, and filling his commentaries with a lot of humble bragging. But now, nearly all of Gaul rises under one leader, Vercingetorix. He's young, charismatic, and he understands Roman tactics well enough to counter them. After a string of clashes, he and his followers retreat onto the hilltop fortress of Alesia, perched on a plateau with steep slopes and natural defenses. Most generals would have sighed, "Well, let's come back later," and move on. Not Caesar. He looks up at this fortress, shrugs, and says, "Okay, we'll just build a bigger fortress around your fortress." Caesar claimed that he had about 50,000 legionaries, each one not only a fighter, but also a trained builder. So he orders a massive circumvallation, a line of fortifications encircling Alesia. According to Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, this included trenches, palisades, towers every 80 feet, and even traps like pits and stakes hidden in the ground. The whole thing stretched roughly 10 miles. But he doesn't stop there. Caesar knows Gallic reinforcements might show up, so he builds a second wall facing outward, another 14 miles long. Picture it: fortress in the middle, Romans sandwiched in between, and an outer wall to keep enemies out. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy calls it one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering in history. It is like Caesar built a giant, two-layered lasagna of death. Now imagine life for a legionary here. By day, you're digging trenches, cutting timber, erecting towers. By night, you're on guard, waiting for sorties from the besieged Gauls. You've got your scutum leaned nearby, your pilum ready, and your short gladius for the inevitable hand-to-hand brawls when Gauls try to break through. It's backbreaking, dangerous, relentless work, but Roman discipline holds. Eventually, word spreads, and a massive Gallic relief army arrives, maybe 100,000 or more. The Gauls inside the fortress cheer. Now the Romans are trapped between two forces. Caesar describes the tension. The cries of the combatants filled the night, and the men were equally in suspense, awaiting the issue. Attacks slam on both the inner and outer walls. On one side, Gauls charge downhill from Alesia, hurling spears and arrows. On the other, the relief force hammers the outer defenses, trying to break the Romans' ring. Legionaries shift back and forth, running from one line to the other, fighting, then grabbing shovels to repair breaches. It's chaos. At the climax, the outer Gallic army breaks through a weak spot. Roman auxiliaries falter. For a moment, it looks like Caesar is finished. And here's where the war machine becomes something more: leadership. Caesar himself gallops to the breach, wearing his scarlet cloak so every soldier can see him. He throws in his last reserves, the German cavalry, and steadies the line. The Gallic assault collapses. The relief force scatters. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix realizes it's over. He rides out in full armor, circles Caesar's camp, then dismounts and lays his sword at Caesar's feet. Game, set, match. So why does Alesia matter? It wasn't just a battle. It was a demonstration. Rome didn't just beat enemies with brute force. It beat them with organization, engineering, and relentless discipline. Polybius had once praised the Romans for their fortified camps, but at Alesia, Caesar takes that to a whole new level. Walls within walls, soldiers who could fight one moment and dig the next. A system where even under immense pressure, the machine kept moving. It's no wonder historians see Alesia as the battle that broke Gallic independence for good. The war machine didn't just march, it built, adapted, and suffocated its opponents until resistance was impossible. And that's why, when we think of the Roman army, Alesia is right up there with great showcases of its power. It's the exact opposite of Cannae, the moment when discipline and ingenuity turned a desperate gamble into a lasting triumph. We've seen Rome at its lowest with Cannae, and at its most brilliant with Alesia. Now let's go to the battle that haunted emperors, reshaped Rome's ambitions, and left an open wound in Roman memory: the Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE. The setting: Germania. Picture dense forests, boggy swamps, heavy rains, and twisting paths. Not the kind of open plains where the legions thrived. Governor Publius Quintilius Varus was marching with 3 full legions, maybe 15,000 to 20,000 men, plus camp followers, wagons, and auxiliaries. His job? Keep the peace in the newly pacified territory. But there was a problem: his trusted ally Arminius. He was a chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, but he had also served in the Roman army, learned Latin, earned Roman citizenship, and studied Roman tactics. On paper, the perfect partner. In reality, the perfect traitor. Tacitus later said Arminius pretended friendship while planning treachery. As Varus's column stretched through the forest, rain poured down. The heavy Scuda shields soaked up water, the iron armor rusted. The narrow trails broke the column into pieces. According to Cassius Dio, wagons got stuck in the mud, troops were forced to chop through trees, and discipline unraveled. Imagine trying to march a parade through a jungle during a thunderstorm. That's where the Roman machine fell apart. Then came the ambush. Arminius and his Germanic warriors swarmed out of the woods, hurling spears, charging from all sides. The legions tried to form up, but there was no room for the neat triplex aces lines or testudo formations. Shields bashed against tree trunks, pila snagged in branches, and cavalry had no space to maneuver. For the soldiers, it was chaos. The sound of war horns echoed in the rain, arrows and javelins rained down, men slipped in mud, tripped over wagons, collided with each other in a panic. The machine that had crushed Gauls and Greeks suddenly couldn't even assemble itself. The battle didn't end in one clash. It dragged on for 3 days. Every time the Romans tried to regroup, the Germans vanished into the forest, only to attack again at the next choke point. Cassius Dio paints a brutal picture. The Romans trapped, exhausted, surrounded by constant skirmishes, morale collapsing. By the 3rd day, the legions were broken apart piecemeal. Their eagles, symbol of Roman pride, captured by the enemy. The losses were catastrophic. Velleius Paterculus, who knew survivors, called it the most shameful disaster in Roman history. Out of the 3 legions, very few escaped. Most were slaughtered or enslaved. And the reaction back in Rome? Sheer despair. Emperor Augustus reportedly tore his clothes and cried out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." For years, Romans refused to speak of the defeat. Soldiers were said to weep if they heard the word Varus. Strategically, Teutoburg Forest was a turning point. Rome pulled back to the Rhine River and essentially abandoned hopes of fully conquering Germania. The empire reached its practical limit. Adrian Goldsworthy notes that Rome realized not all land was worth conquering. Sometimes the cost outweighed the benefit. Maybe the most striking part? Even here, the Romans eventually adapted. A generation later, Germanicus, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, led campaigns to avenge the defeat, recovering two of the lost legionary eagles. Tacitus tells us he even visited the battlefield, where bleached Roman bones still littered the forest floor. Imagine walking through the ruins of your own war machine years later and swearing it wouldn't happen again. Still, the scar never really healed. Teutoburg became Rome's nightmare story, a reminder that the machine could be broken if pulled into the wrong battlefield. And it set the limits of the empire. Gaul and the Rhine would be Roman. Germania beyond the river would not. So, after disasters like Cannae and Teutoburg, and triumphs like Alesia, what kept the Roman war machine going? The answer is that Rome eventually stopped relying on part-time citizen soldiers and created something the ancient world had rarely seen: a fully professional standing army. Let's rewind to the 2nd century BCE. Enter Gaius Marius, the man who reformed the army around 107 BCE. Before Marius, only landowners could serve in Rome's legions. That meant your average legionary was a farmer first, soldier second. But Rome needed more manpower. So Marius threw open the doors. Landless poor could now enlist. For many, this wasn't just duty, it was a career path. In fact, historians call this moment the birth of the professional soldier. From then on, the Roman army wasn't a part-time militia. It became a career of 20 to 25 years. Imagine signing up at 18 and not getting out until you're in your 40s. That's longer than most modern military contracts. Soldiers received regular wages. Caesar himself raised pay to 225 denarii a year, and they were promised land or cash upon retirement. The government sweetened the deal with bonuses, loot from campaigns, and sometimes citizenship for auxiliaries, the non-Roman troops. For a poor man with no property, the army offered food, pay, adventure, and eventually a farm to retire on. Not a bad package deal. A professional legionary wasn't just a fighter. He was also an endurance athlete, engineer, and construction worker. Vegetius says soldiers were trained to march up to 20 miles a day, carrying 80 pounds of gear. That's why they were nicknamed Marius's mules. Imagine hiking with the full REI kit on your back every day. Each soldier carried his kit. Armor, Larissa Hamada or Segmentata, depending on the era. Weapons, Gladius, Pilum, Pugio. Shield, the scutum. Tools, spades, picks, saws, and iron stakes for camp defenses. Rations, grain, bacon, sour wine, or dried vegetables. A cloak, cooking pot, and sometimes dice or game pieces for downtime. At the end of every march, legionaries built a fortified camp. Ditches, palisades, gates, all laid out with military precision. Tacitus and Polybus both note that this habit was more than defense, it was discipline. Every night, Rome built a miniature city, a reminder that order followed the eagle standards wherever the legions marched. A legion now had about 4,800 to 5,200 men, divided into 10 cohorts. Each cohort had 6 entries, led by centurions. And here's where the backbone of discipline really was. Centurions were the grizzled veterans, men with scars, gravely voices, and zero patience for laziness. They carried the vitis, a vine staff, and weren't shy about using it to keep order. By the time of Augustus, Rome had around 28 legions, each permanently stationed along the frontiers: the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Syria, the hills of Judea, and the forests of Britain. The war machine wasn't just marching into battle anymore. It was Rome's border patrol, peacekeepers, and occupation force. The catch? This professionalization made Rome more powerful, but it also created a dangerous shift. Soldiers weren't just loyal to Rome, they were loyal to the general who paid them. Caesar's men marched with him across the Rubicon, not because of patriotic duty, but because Caesar had given them victory, pay, and promises of land. As Adrian Goldsworthy points out in The Complete Roman Army, this loyalty shift is one of the biggest reasons the Republic collapsed and emperors rose. Once the army became the ultimate power broker, the men who commanded the most legions usually ended up ruling. Life after service. If you survived 20 to 25 years, and that's a big if, you received a land grant or pension. Veterans often settled in colonies across the empire, spreading Roman culture into new territories. In many ways, the army wasn't just Rome's sword, it was also a cultural conveyor belt. So picture it, an army of hardened professionals, each one trained to fight, march, and build. They wore standardized armor, drilled in unison, and could throw up a fortress faster than most enemies could throw a party. They weren't farmers with spears anymore. They were the Roman war machine perfected. Of course, perfection had its flaws. Professional soldiers were expensive. They could also be political kingmakers. For centuries, this system allowed Rome to project power from the foggy forests of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. And that, more than anything, is what turned a small city on the Tiber into a center of a vast empire. So, what made the Roman war machine so legendary? Was it the sharpness of the gladius, the size of the scutum, the discipline drilled into every maniple and cohort? Sure, all of that mattered, but if we zoom out, what we really see is a system, an evolving, adaptive machine that could survive defeats, reinvent itself, and keep moving forward. At first, it was just farmers with spears, bumping into each other in a clumsy phalanx. But Rome learned. The manipular legion gave flexibility. Standardized weapons and armor gave cohesion. Fortified camps and engineering genius gave Rome a sense of performance. And above all, discipline held it together. When Rome lost at Cannae, most states would have surrendered. But Rome said, fine, we'll raise another army. When Gauls thought they had Caesar trapped at Alesia, Rome built not one, but two walls and suffocated them into submission. And when 3 legions were swallowed by the forests of Teutoburg, Rome reeled, grieved, and then adapted its strategy, shifting from reckless expansion to holding the empire's borders. This isn't just a story about weapons or battles, it's about resilience. The Roman war machine worked because it combined grit, innovation, and an almost stubborn refusal to give up. And for centuries, that's what kept the empire alive. But here's the thing we often forget. The legions didn't just fight, they built. And the greatest thing they built wasn't just camps or siege walls, it was roads. So next time on Once Upon Yesterday, we'll leave the battlefield behind and follow Roman roads. These highways of the empire stretched thousands of miles, stitched together provinces, and became the arteries that carried Roman power, culture, and trade across 3 continents. We'll see how they were built, who walked them, and why some of them are still with us today. Until then, keep your shields locked, your sword sharp, and your curiosity sharper. Thanks for marching with me today.